All right, so we're diving deep today. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. I'm excited to see what we find. We've got a lot to work with. We've got excerpts directly from the Bible, of course, which is always great. And then we've got commentaries, different perspectives. And then to help us apply it all, there's a study guide too. It's going to be a good one.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of insights packed into this text. It's going to be fun. A lot of them are really relevant for us today, even though this was written so long ago.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You know, one of the things I noticed when I was kind of looking through it all earlier was this interesting connection between godliness and contentment. It's not like something you immediately think of together.
Right. It is kind of a surprising link. But as we get into these verses, I think you'll see that they're actually very deeply connected.
Cool. Okay, well, let's just jump right in. So verses 1 and 2, we've got these instructions for servants. Specifically, it seems to be talking about servants who serve non-believing masters. It says that they should show all honor so that they don't blaspheme the name of God and his doctrine. I found that really interesting. It's almost like prioritizing God's reputation, even in situations that are, could be really challenging.
Yeah. I mean, think about the context of the early church. This is a time of persecution and misunderstanding. And Paul, the one writing this letter, he knew that the actions of believers, even those in these difficult positions, could either, reflect really well on the Christian community or make it look bad, right?
So even if you were in a tough work environment, your actions were about something bigger. It's like a testament to your faith. It really makes you think about how that applies today,
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, think about your own workplace, how you interact with colleagues, with clients, even with bosses, especially the difficult ones. How does your faith play into your actions in those situations? Are you living out the values and the teachings of Christ even when it's tough?
Yeah, it's easy to talk about faith, but really living it out, that's different. So moving on, we get to verses 3 to 5, and there's this really vivid description of false teachers. Paul doesn't hold back. He calls them proud, knowing nothing but doting about questions and strifes of words. I was struck by how these guys, they twist faith into something for their own personal gain. You know what I mean?
Totally, yeah. The text really does pinpoint some characteristics of these false teachers. The pride is there, right? Big sense of pride, but no real knowledge or understanding. And they love these empty arguments, wordplay over actual, spiritual wisdom. And like you said, the worst part is that dangerous idea that, be godly and you'll get rich.
Yeah, it's like they're kind of manipulating people. Taking advantage of their desires for a better life and using religion to do it. It's like you see today with those prosperity gospel preachers.
Right. There are definitely some parallels there. But it's important to note that, Paul's not against legitimate work or being financially stable. It's more like a warning against those who are, kind of taking advantage of people, twisting the real meaning of faith for their own selfish reasons.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So then, verse 6, there's this incredible shift. We go from this warning about false teachers to this totally different definition of gain. Paul says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. It's like he's saying, forget about all the material stuff. Real riches, they're in something else entirely.
Yeah, and then in verses 7 and 8, he uses this powerful image. We brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. The point is clear, right? The stuff we have, it's temporary. You can't find real satisfaction in things or, lasting security.
So it always comes back to that connection between godliness and contentment.
But what does being content actually mean? Is it just passively accepting whatever happens?
Yeah.
Or is there more to it than that?
Well, when the Bible talks about contentment, it doesn't mean you just give up and don't care. It's more about finding satisfaction and peace right where you are. Not because everything's perfect, because you trust God that he'll provide and that he has a plan. It's recognizing that real joy, it doesn't come from what you own. It comes from who you are in Christ.
So it's more of an internal thing, your perspective. It's not about the stuff.
Right. And that's a pretty big deal, especially in a world where we're always being told to buy more, achieve more, be more.
Yeah.
It's this constant message that we're not enough. And so it's a challenge to choose contentment in a culture that's basically built on discontent, right? And that makes me think of, all the marketing we're bombarded with every day. Do we really need all that stuff? Like the newest gadget, a bigger house, those fancy vacations? Or are we just buying into this idea that we're always lacking something?
Those are some really good questions. And Honestly, I think a lot of the time wanting all those things comes from, feeling like we don't have enough, like we need more to be happy. But true contentment, it comes from realizing what we already have in Christ.
And maybe that contentment actually frees us up to be more generous. Like we can focus on the things that truly matter.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. When we're not consumed with wanting more, we have more space, more freedom to be generous with our time, our talents, and yeah, our resources too.
Okay. So we've talked about godliness and contentment and how that's the real game. But there's this verse, it's hard to ignore, the one verse 10. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. It's one of those famous verses, but people get it wrong all the time.
It's so important to understand the nuance there. It's not about money being evil. It's about the love of money. It's that desire, that wanting more and more that takes over and controls you. And it ultimately pulls you away from the things that really matter.
One of the commentaries we have, it connects this straying from the faith to like self-inflicted sorrow. It's like people chase money thinking it'll make them happy, but all they end up with is more pain and emptiness.
It's a trap a lot of people fall into. We think, oh, if I just had more money, my problems would be gone. But the truth is, if you don't have contentment and, some sort of moral compass, wealth can actually make your problems worse. It can lead you down a really destructive path.
Right. So it's not about saying wealth is bad. It's about recognizing how dangerous it can be if you become too attached to it.
That's it. And that's why it's so important for us to look at our own hearts. Like, what's really motivating our financial decisions? Are we trying to honor God with our money, or are we letting the desire for wealth run our lives?
Whoa, some deep questions there. And it feels like Paul is getting into even more complicated stuff as we go further into this passage.
He is. We're about to get into some specific instructions for, people who actually do have wealth. It's like he's giving a framework for how to handle money in a way that lines up with faith.
Yeah, that's what I'm really interested in because those instructions, they seem to be the opposite of that love of money idea we've been talking about.
It's a topic that's just as relevant today as it was back then. Let's dive in and see what we can learn.
I'm ready. This is where it gets really interesting.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, so we're just talking about how dangerous it is to love money and how the real gain is all about being content. But then in verses 17, 19, Paul starts talking to those who are actually wealthy. It's kind of a shift, right? So what's he saying here? Is it okay to be rich, or is he changing his mind about what he just said?
Yeah, it's not so much about condemning wealth itself. It's more like, how do we handle it? These verses, they make a really important point. It's about the difference between having wealth and being controlled by wealth.
Oh, okay. So the problem isn't the money. It's how you think about it.
Exactly. Paul is saying, don't put your hope in riches because let's face it, riches are uncertain. Instead, trust in the living God. That's a huge shift. It's moving your focus from material stuff to relying on something bigger than yourself.
And I notice he doesn't just say, okay, rich people, give all your money away. He talks about being rich in good works, ready to distribute, willing to communicate. There's more to it than just saying wealth is bad.
Right. Paul's putting the emphasis on using wealth to do good, to be generous, to share with people who need it. It's not about keeping it all to yourself. It's about helping others.
Yeah, it's like he's redefining what it means to be rich. It's not about what you have, but what you do with it,
Yeah,
making a positive impact.
that's it. And, this ties back into that idea of contentment we were discussing before. When you find that satisfaction in God instead of, all the stuff you have, you're actually more free to be generous, more willing to share what you've been given.
You know what that makes me think of? Stewardship. Like we're not just given resources for ourselves. We're supposed to manage them well, use them for good for others, and ultimately to honor God.
Exactly. It's like we're stewards of what we have, but it all belongs to God.
There's a section in the study guide that goes deeper into this idea of stewardship. Talks about, practical ways to apply this to our own finances, no matter how much money you have. I think it'd be good for people to check that out later.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it can be tough to actually live out our faith when it comes to money, especially in today's world. But that section, it offers some good steps we can take.
Okay, so let's move on. As we get towards the end of this passage, we come to verse 20. This is where Paul gives Timothy, his younger friend and follower, some really strong advice. He says, "O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust. avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science, falsely so-called. Man, that's a lot in one verse. What stands out to you?
It's amazing how relevant that verse is today. I mean, think about it. Profane and vain babblings. It's like all the empty chatter. We're surrounded by all the noise and distractions that pull us away from, what's actually true and wise.
Yeah, like all the social media stuff, the news, the endless arguments online. It's hard to filter through all that and find what's real.
And then there's the phrase oppositions of science, falsely so called. That one's really interesting, right? It's like even knowledge, especially when people are presenting it as the absolute truth, it can be misleading. It can even be harmful, especially if it goes against, the basic truths of faith.
So it's not about rejecting science, or anything like that. It's about being smart about what information you trust. It's about finding the ideas that match up with our values. And it's also about, like, being careful about what people call truths that might actually be leading us down the wrong path.
Oh, exactly. We need to be critical thinkers. We need to question things and evaluate the information we're given. And ultimately, we need to stick to the teachings that, have always been true, the teachings that bring us closer to God and, help us live lives that have meaning.
Yeah. And that's tough, because in today's world, everyone seems to have their own version of truth. It's easy to get swept up in all that and forget what really matters. But Paul, he's reminding us to ground ourselves in something much deeper, something that lasts.
He is. And that grounding, it comes from Jesus and what the Bible teaches. It's about lining our lives up with God's truth, and that goes way beyond like human opinions, which are always changing.
This whole conversation makes me think about how important it is to be able to, like, discern. How do we learn to tell the difference between truth and lies, especially when the world is so noisy and confusing?
Oh, that's a great question. We could probably do a whole nother deep dive just on that, but I think this passage gives us some hints.
Like what?
Well, one thing is, grounding yourself in the Bible. It's like a foundation for understanding who God is, what he wants for us, and the things that lead to, a good and fulfilling life.
So it's not just about reading it, right? It's about studying it, really thinking about it, and letting it, shape how you see the world.
That's right. And that takes humility, being willing to learn and grow and, being open to being challenged.
And it probably helps to have other believers around you,
Yeah.
people to help you figure things out, to challenge you when you need it, and to encourage you when you're on the right track.
Absolutely, yeah. We weren't meant to go through this alone. We need wise people to guide us, friends to support us, and a community of faith to keep us accountable.
So like that saying, iron sharpens iron.
Yeah, exactly. And that sharpening happens when we're together, when we're in a community that's committed to seeking truth, wanting to be more godly, and living out their faith in a way that honors God and helps others.
It's like the passage itself is showing us how to approach these topics. It's not just about, like, figuring it out on your own. It's about talking it through, sharing ideas, and challenging each other to, really understand.
That's a great point. And that's what we're doing right now, right? We're taking this old text and trying to see how it applies to our lives today. And I hope that, whoever's listening feels like they can keep exploring this on their own too.
Me too. Because, honestly, we've only scratched the surface here. There's still so much more to discover in this passage.
That's the amazing thing about the Bible, right? It's like a well that never runs dry. Every time you come back to it, there's something new to learn, a new challenge, a new insight.
All right, so last question, the one I always ask. What's one thing from today's deep dive that our listener might want to ponder on their own? Something that we didn't really talk about, but that maybe sparked your own curiosity.
Oh, that's a good one. When we were discussing that verse about the love of money being the root of all evil, it got me thinking, what's the root of all good then?
Wow, that's a really good question.
Is it like pure love? Is it faith? Or is it something else entirely? I don't have the answer, but it's been on my mind ever since.
I think that's a perfect question to leave our listener with. Something to think about, maybe even discuss with their friends and family.
It's been a pleasure, as always, diving into these thought-provoking texts with you. Same here. And to our listener, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your insights, and maybe even your own ideas about the root of all good. Connect with us on social media or visit our website. Until next time, happy exploring.
It really makes you think, like on the one hand, there's this pull towards, material wealth, all that stuff. But then there's also this, like, deeper longing for something more, something with real meaning.
Yeah, and that struggle, it's been around forever. People have always tried to figure out what makes a good life, what truly matters.
And it feels like in this passage from Timothy, we get a different perspective. It's not about saying, no to earthly pleasures or living in poverty. It's more about understanding that real fulfillment, it comes from aligning yourself with God's purpose for your life.
Right, and that often means, using what we have, whether it's money or something else, to make a difference for others, to be generous and compassionate, to show love.
Which brings us back to that idea of being, what was it? Rich in good works,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's not about how much you have, it's about how much you give.
Exactly. And it's not just about money either. It's about giving your time, your talents, your energy, putting it all towards something good, something that makes a real difference in the world.
It's about understanding that we're all connected, that what we do affects others too.
Yeah, it all comes back around. Remember those instructions to servants at the beginning of the passage? Even though they were in a, tough position, their actions could still reflect on God.
It's like a reminder that every little thing we do matters. Even the small choices, they can be an act of faith.
It's about living with purpose, knowing that we're a part of something bigger.
And even in a world that's so focused on, getting more stuff, getting richer, we can choose a different way, a way that leads to like true contentment, real joy, and a legacy that lasts longer than anything you can buy.
Beautifully said. I think we've really covered some important ground today.
We have. And I bet our listeners have a lot to say about this too. Lots of questions and ideas.
I'm sure they do. We'd love for them to keep digging into this passage, think about it more, talk about it with others.
That's what the deep dive is all about, right? Sparking curiosity, helping people think critically, and making space for conversations that matter.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.
And until next time, keep diving deep.